Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Change Wired podcast. And I have a treat for you. You know, one of those conversations when you have with a very smart person and they give you a lot of ahas and you feel like an enriched knowledge-wise person after the conversation, but also it ends up being really fun. And after the conversation, you had amazing time, you learned a ton, and you want to do something with that knowledge. So that's the kind of conversation that you are about to hear. I had an amazing time, and you're going to have an amazing time too listening to this podcast episode with Matt Wallaert. Guys, so what if changing culture, shifting habits, or transforming a company or maybe entire world was less like crossing your fingers and more like following a recipe? My guest today, applied behavioral scientist Matt Wallaert, has spent his career turning human behavior into something you can design for. Just like you would design a product, a service, maybe a website page, or maybe your own life. In this episode, we talk about the method Matt used and uses to change behavior at scale in organizations internally for products and services to help users improve their lives through changing their behaviors. We talk about why fuzzy leadership language might be killing business results and culture, and how M&Ms, the candy M&Ms, VR boxing and parenting all hold clues for making behavior change easier. We also wander into some questions around ethics and talk about when you can change someone's behavior. Should you? And when enough is enough, and when it goes sideways, what do you do? Where do you step? So stay tuned for that as well. There's going to be a lot of humor and even some productivity tricks from Matt. So grab a notebook, your favorite snack, hopefully not M&Ms, and let's get wired for change.
What should people know about me?
Yeah, first, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me on Change Wired podcast, Matt. It's amazing. Like, I'm happy over the moon that you found the time to do that. I'm very excited, have a lot of questions, and real fan of your work. So hopefully we'll make it also useful for the listeners, not just for my enjoyment. But anyhow, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me.
And thank you for having me. I mean, I think if we enjoy the conversation, then they'll enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, I also believe so. So the first question is, who's Matt Wallaert, and maybe brief history of Matt Wallaert, how it started, what you stopped, and where it's going.
Well, I think it started the way most of us start. You know, I was born on a stormy night in 1982. No, self-identity is always an interesting thing. It's interesting to see how people introduce themselves. I mean, I think in the context of this podcast, the most important thing to know is that, I graduated from college in 2004 when applied behavioral science was not a thing. So I spent the first several years of my career, being in rooms where people went, "What do you do again? And what is this science thing? And like, why do you have a scientist on staff?" Startups at the time, science wasn't a big part of the startup community. It was a very design-led sort of version of the world. Scientists are much more common now. And then now to a point where like applied behavioral science is very much a thing. It's something most people know about. It's something commonly talked about in business. So it's been interesting to live through those times, right? I went from doing a job that nobody knew what it was to a job that people actually want. It's amazing to me these days. I talk to young people who are like, "Oh yeah, like I came into college knowing that I wanted to be an applied behavioral scientist." I'm like, well, that's novel. Right?
How do you feel about that?
Great. I mean, I think that's awesome. I mean, I think it's lovely. It's just really interesting to see something that you had to explain at the beginning now becomes something that people actually aspire to do, right? It's like, I don't know, watching the popularity of a sport rise or something. And there are these limited moments in history, I think, where, a new type of career path comes about. The best analogy for for the spread of applied behavioral science is always the spread of data science, right? And I'm sure that Hillary Mason and other people also lived through a weird period of time where they're like, I'm a data scientist, and people are like, what's that? And now people very much like go into college with the intention of becoming a data scientist, and that is a thing that they want to do. So it's not, we're not alone in our development, but it is certainly novel to have lived through.
Yeah, a question, why did you decide to study that when, nobody even knew about that, nobody talked about that?
I mean, I sort of fell into it. So I'm a social psychologist by training. I came into college very much not interested in psychology. I was very much a biology guy. And then, but I took an intro psych class, which was awful, awful, awful. But I also took another psych class called the Psychology of Self-Control. And it was taught by this really magnificent professor who really is a fantastic teacher, Andrew Ward, still at Swarthmore, still a great teacher. And he, was so engaging and thoughtful about how he sort of made psychology relevant to the sort of everyday lives of college students. And I had a very particular experience wherein we read a paper on something called the IAT, the implicit association test, which purports to basically, it's a reaction time test. You're sort of categorizing pictures and words and things. And the idea is that it can detect your implicit association. So, if you think black is bad and white is good, like it can detect that. Yeah. And I didn't disagree with the data, right? I didn't think it was falsified, in so much as I sort of felt like the conclusion overreached the data, right? Hey, they're drawing conclusions that I don't know are directly supported by the evidence. And Professor Ward said something really fascinating to me, which was, well, the field agrees with this interpretation. The field has decided this is valid. But this is science. And so there's like an orderly way for you to respond, which is to generate your own evidence. And if you want to come to my lab and run an experiment and try and generate evidence that shows that their interpretation is incorrect, that's how science progresses forward. And so you're welcome to come do that. And I'm happy to sort of give you some guidance in doing that, which is such a lovely thing to say to a young person, right? Like there's a version of the world where like evil Andrew Ward says like, nope, it's been proven you're wrong. Like, listen to the scientists, shut the fuck up. What I love about science is it always has an orderly way to respond, which is with additional evidence. Like you can do an experiment, you can bring evidence into the conversation, and you can find out whether you're right or wrong, which is so different from so many parts of the world, right? So many parts of academia and so many parts of everyday life are about who has the most social power, or who like is the most convincing, or like is the most, sort of knows English the best, like whatever the fuck it is, right? Whoever has power in a situation gets to determine the rules of that situation. Science is this incredibly unique part of human experience where it at least when done correctly, the powerful do not have differential power. And that is amazing to me.
Yeah, it is amazing, and you're right. Like most of the world is like, this is right or this is wrong. And most of the people are not even comfortable with this idea. Like, well, maybe in this context, maybe in that context, and maybe there is a middle way. And be with a lot of maybes, like it's like you have to pick a side. So that's amazing. So I guess that's how you fell in love with what you decided to study.
Yeah, I was hooked from then. So that certainly got the science part. And of course, social psychology very much, the only observational thing is behavior, right? You can't do emotions or cognitions because we don't have any access to emotions or cognitions. Like we don't actually know how anybody's feels. We don't actually know what people think. We know what they tell us. We know what they self-report, but we only know their behavior, right?
Yeah.
And so, certainly the science bit I fell in love with through Andrew. The behavior bit is something social psychology brings to you. And then the applied bit I really figured out in grad school. So I'm a first generation college kid. I didn't know anything about getting a PhD, but I ended up in a PhD program and very quickly figured out this was not going to be it for me, because academia is about the pursuit of knowledge, right? It's about furthering our understanding of the universe, but it's not actually about changing anything, right? Yeah. And if you think about the Platonic ideal, like the superpower of a scientist would be like, well, I snap my fingers and the world stays in stasis so that I can study it, right? Because all of this changing, all this dynamicism just creates noise in my data. And so if I could just freeze everything and make it stay still, I would be able to study it effectively. I don't want that superpower. That's a terrible superpower. right? Or at least it was a bad superpower for me, right? What I want is the ability to like go and make things better for people. I want Angela to live a happier, healthier life. And so I was very, I figured out quickly that rather than this academic route, I wanted to go applied. And so science from Andrew, behavior from social psychology, and then applied from understanding that like academia was not going to be the right place for me.
Yeah, so I can relate to that piece that whenever I learn something, I'm almost immediately putting it into action into my life because for me it's like, well, if you know it, you should use it. And then it at some point it was such a discovery for me that people just listen to a ton of Andrew Huberman podcasts and then don't apply anything, and they're totally happy about that. And I'm like, that I cannot understand. So I understand that like a applied part of it that I could never understand. Like, how can you just care about knowledge, but not about applicability of that knowledge and changing the world with it?
Well, in nature, and I think knowledge can be, I think there's an entertaining form of knowledge. I think there's a bunch of people, for example, who read self-help books in the same way they're reading a fictional book. They like the feelings it gives them. It's interesting. They like the style of writing, etc. Right? In the same way one might watch a nature documentary and know something more about whales than they knew before in an entertaining way without necessarily doing anything different with regard to like, they don't have any ability to behave differently around whales. So I think as long as you know that, it's fine, right? If you want to read self-help books for entertainment, go nuts, right? Like you can entertain
Yeah.
yourself however you want. But if you're, to your point, but if you're reading them so that you can have a happier, healthier life, you do have to do something with it. Like mere knowledge almost never makes somebody happier or healthier, right? Merely knowing something doesn't tend to sort of do much for people's happiness and health. They have to put it into practice in some way. And so
Yeah.
if the goal is entertainment, go nuts. If the goal is a happier, healthier life, you're gonna have to do something.
Yes, I agree with that. I want to here to talk more about behavioral science specifically, right? Can you tell listeners what is it? Like we just talked about so much about, why you fell in love in it with it and how. So what is it and why people should care?
Yeah, so applied behavioral science is, I would think of it somewhat like a design methodology. I think each of the words means something really specific. Applied, right? We're trying to change stuff here. Behavior is the thing we're trying to change, not emotions or cognitions or outcomes. We're trying to change behaviors that lead to those things. And then science as a design process. So not science in order to prove, not in science in order to gather knowledge, but science in order to show what works or what doesn't work. So science is a form of efficacy.
Hmm.
And so there's a variety of different ways that people teach approaches to applied behavioral science. I teach this methodology that we created called SIDE, Strategy, Insights, Design, Evaluation, right? So going through a 4-step process of strategy is just what will be true at the end, right? If you think of science as a genie that can create any outcome,
Hmm.
what is the outcome you're trying to create in a measurable, observable way? Who will be doing what, right, when you're successful? And, typically within my work, that's groups of people, consumers or whoever, but you could use it individually. I will be doing this. My wife will be doing this. My kid will be doing this, right? Same thing. Insights is then the process of understanding quantitatively through data and qualitatively through observation. Why is that outcome not already true,
Hmm.
right? And why do I want it to be true? So we talk about promoting pressures, things that make a behavior more likely, and inhibiting pressures, things that make a behavior less likely. So all behavior is a competition between these two pressures, right? The canonical example I use is always M&Ms, right? There's lots of reasons to eat M&Ms. They're tasty and they are very visually attractive and they're well branded and I have identity things and, they're iconic and all the hunger, all these things. And then there's reasons not to eat them. They cost, they're not free. They have health implications, right? They're not readily available. I have to go seek them out, blah, blah, blah. So those compete, right? And when the promoting pressures are stronger, the behavior occurs. When I get hungry enough, I'll go eat the M&Ms. When the inhibiting pressures are stronger, they become more expensive because of tariffs, then I don't do it, right? Because
Hmm.
so insights is really that method of understanding why is something happening or not happening. Once we understand that, then we can go into a design process. And the key to the design process is we're not changing the behavior. We're changing the pressures that then
Hmm.
results in behavior change, right? So I can make them cheaper And that causes people to eat them more because it reduces the inhibiting pressure. But there's that connection between pressure and behavior, right? It's not
Yeah.
I lower the cost and people eat them more. It's I lower the cost and that lowers the pressure that is cost, and that causes people to eat them more, right? It's not magic. Doing things and having something in the world change is not magic. It is a structured process by which the thing that you changed had a causal relationship with the thing that resulted, and understanding that causal relationship is the nature of science. So strategy, what are we going to change? Insights, why is this happening or not happening already? Design, what are we going to do about it? And then evaluation is just, we can come up with lots of ideas about how to change those pressures, but we don't know, we don't do them because they sound like they'll work. We do them because they actually work, right?
Hmm.
So, if you're like, let's say you think the inhibiting pressure to you working, let's say you want to work out more often, and you think the inhibiting pressure to working out more often is showering, right? Meaning you get real sweaty and so you have to shower. And so you say, all right, well, I'm going to run an experiment where I'm going to work out in the morning before my morning. I normally shower in the morning, so I'm going to work out. I'm going to get up earlier and work out before my shower to see if that, not having to take a second shower at the end of the day makes a difference. And it either will or it won't, right? That is a testable hypothesis. You can do it for 5 weeks and see if you work out more or less, right? So it's not that theoretically something will change behavior. Behavior is directly testable, directly changeable, directly monitorable. And so that's that evaluation step, is just, hey, before you commit to doing something for the long term, before you go make a big change, build a big operation to scale something, make sure it actually works first.
Yeah, it's like also, back to maybe food, because I worked a lot in food. Well, when people say, well, I'm just gonna go on a diet, that sounds great if you can do this diet. So let's test it out for a week and see how well you do, right?
Well, and so let's take dieting, right? So first of all, we have to be clear about the behavior that we want, right? When I'm hungry, I'm going to eat an apple, right? Well, what are all the promoting and inhibiting pressures to apples? People think about, okay, well, I need to get the most delicious apples I can, right? Promoting pressure, but I also need to make them available. So I need to move them, onto the counter rather than hide them away. I need to make sure that I have a bunch of apples. I need to buy them in bulk so they're cheap, right? Like, you can get people to you want to get people to eat apples, put a big bowl of them on their desk. And I guarantee you, if you're sitting next to a big bowl of apples, you'll eat a lot of apples, right?
Yeah.
But the trick there is that, like, the apples are no more delicious or beautiful or anything than they were before. They're just really available, right? And if you make them really available, people will eat them when they're hungry, right? Or out of mindlessness or whatever. And so I think being really thoughtful about the why is what makes behavioral science behavioral science. It's not just saying, well, this is the danger of self-help books. A lot of self-help books say, do this and it'll work, right? And then a lot of people get a message that they're broken because they do it and it doesn't work for them. And the reality is that, like, hey, situations are unique. Pressures are unique. And so you need to test that, hey, for me, this is true, before you just say, all right, well, I'm going to wholesale take the recommendations of a bunch of people.
Yeah, so this evaluation is very important to find what actually works for you. Now, to make it even more concrete for people and even maybe more useful, how do you perhaps use it still behavioral science in your own life to get yourself do things that you maybe not either the things that are not easy or maybe you naturally wouldn't do or are struggling with doing?
Well, I mean, health examples are always the easiest examples, right? Because, it's a goal most people have. It's a goal most people struggle with. It can be really practical things. I'm a boxer by training and inclination. That's the way I like to work out. But, and I have a gym about 15-minute drive from me, probably, right? But that's 15 minutes there and 15 minutes back, which is a half an hour out of my day. I have a 9-year-old, so that's time away from him. Boxing gyms are not cheap. They also have, health risks associated with them. Getting hit in the head's not great on a repetitive basis, et cetera, et cetera. So, over the pandemic, for example, I got really into VR boxing because I can do it at home, right? Right after this podcast, I can, like, strip off this shirt and, like, pop on a VR headset and go right over there into the gym here in the garage and, like, start working out. And so it's not that boxing is any more attractive than it ever was. I've just made it substantially easier for me to do in an organized way. And so it's things like that generally help me. I think on the flip side, I do it all the time in parenting, right? So there's this temptation in parenting. Well, my kid is doing something that I don't want him to do. So I'll introduce punishment or new inhibiting pressure. Hey, if you do that, there's going to be a consequence. If you do that, this thing's going to happen. And very often we just need to look at the promoting pressure. Why is he doing that in the first place?
Yeah.
Right. And like, how do I short circuit that? Oh, he's acting out because he wants my attention. Cool. Like, how can I give him attention in more positive ways rather than creating, punishments for him asking for my attention? And so that process of just starting to recognize, hey, like, there are reasons that people do things. Behavior is not just random, right? Like, behavior comes from places, and those forces can be modified such that behavior is modified.
Yes. And, I can so relate to the just that usefulness of behavioral science in our relationships with other people in the world, in a sense that, for example, when somebody is rude to you, you might say, well, they just rude, they're just this bad person. But instead, you might think, oh, they are behaving in this way because they might have had a bad day, or just, something happened, or they didn't have good sleep. And then you got the behavior, not the person, which is entirely bad, but just the behavior. And probably in other situations, that person behaves in a completely different way, right? And that helped me to like really, I don't know, have better relationship with the world and people, because I don't take things personally, but look at each individual case as an individual behavior.
And I think one of the things you said is really key there is there's no such thing as this person is rude, right? Angela is rude. No, Angela is doing a behavior that you interpret as rude. So focusing in on that behavior is really key. In marriage and family therapy, we often teach a sentence structure that is, when you A, I feel B because C, and what I'd really like is D. So when you specific behavior, I have specific emotional reaction because of specific cognition, and what I'd really like is alternative behavior. So rather than saying Angela's a rude person or Angela acts in a rude way, when Angela interrupts me, okay, that's a specific behavior, right?
Yeah.
That's a really specific thing. So, Angela, when you interrupt me, it makes me feel sad because it makes me feel like you don't care about what I'm saying. So what I'd really like is for you to let me finish talking before you jump in. That's a really specific piece of feedback, right? But so much of what we do is we say things like, Angela, you're so rude. Or Angela, when you're rude. Well, what the fuck does that mean? Right? I don't know what rude means. Like maybe I'm not interpreting, lots of cultures, for example, have something we call co-talking, which means they actively talk over each other and it's not considered rude. Maybe I don't see the thing I'm doing as rude. So Angela, when you're a dick is not very useful, right? Getting to that really specific behavioral part is really key. And I think that applies across lots of the examples we've used today. When you say I want to eat healthier, what do you mean? You mean I want to eat less red meat? You mean I want to eat more vegetables? You mean I want more protein? You mean I want to eat less in general? Like, what does that mean? There's about 80,000 versions of eat more healthy. What do you physically, literally mean you want to have happen? Because I go back to the genie analogy. Like every genie movie is about the lesson that wishes have to be carefully formulated, right? Angela says, I want to be the fastest woman alive. Matt rubs his fuzzy bald head, snaps his fingers, kills all the other women on Earth. Congratulations, Angela, you're the fastest woman alive. Getting precise about like the outcome. I want to work out more. What does that mean? I want to work out twice a week for 30 minutes. That means something real. That's something I can do something out. I want to work out more. I don't know. I can't engage with that because it doesn't mean anything.
Yes, and then also it makes easier, it's a sort of not being all out person, but instead like I want to work out more when maybe that means 10 minutes more than the last week, which makes the whole process of change a lot more approachable. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, it also, well, maybe you didn't mention, but what I heard, it doesn't then makes things personal. They or related to identity, which makes communication with people in general easier. It means like, again, if I say that I don't like a behavior, it doesn't mean I don't like you. I just don't like the behavior no matter who does it, right? Whereas when we say like you're rude or you're that or you're that, it's like you're attacking a person and then the person fights back because you are attacking them personally. So I feel like that's also so powerful in a social change and relationship, like in conflict resolution, negotiation, when we apply this behavioral science lens.
Yeah, it's true because it isn't, to your point, it's not even about you interrupting. It's just about people in general interrupting, right?
Yes, exactly. And you just the one who's doing the behavior. And I think like once I understood the whole process and this lens, it made just life so much easier. I'm like, ah, this is just the behavior. Oh, like with my dad, he always, sees something which is incorrect or could be better. And at first, I thought it was something wrong with me. And they're like, no, he actually does this behavior towards everything around him. So it's not me, it's the behavior pattern. I'm like, oh, that made the whole relationship also easier because I started to see it through again different lens. Switching gears a little bit, I'd like to also talk about business world because this podcast has the audience, the business leaders, entrepreneurs, and as well, and they always ask, okay, now I understand how I can apply it in my life. Like, what about business environment? And maybe like you worked in different environments. You worked with startups, you worked with in big organizations, right? So where maybe you'd like to start, I guess maybe where you see behavioral science can be very useful in a business world in general, maybe where you see it's not applied enough and it's a big frustration, like, because yeah, business world is obviously a big thing. So what speaks to you and maybe what you'd like to talk more about?
Yeah, I mean, where so you asked where I see it most often. I mean, the closer that, if we think about business, about profitability, the
Mhm.
closer your profit is to a behavior change, the easier it is to see behavioral science as vital. So if you look at industries like banking or finance, you look at industries like health or health change, right? Those are places where it's abundantly clear that, like, if I can get people to do thing A, I make money B, right? And the farther that you get from that, hey, if I get people to do thing A and then they do thing B and then they do thing C and then they do thing D and then I make money, it makes it harder and harder to make, behavioral science still applies, but companies are less likely to invest in it because they don't see the direct connection. So I think if you ask me, the second question you asked me is, where am I frustrated? Where do I not see it as much as I'd like? I think a lot of behavioral science is very externally applied. I'm going to get consumers, I'm going to get my buyers to do a thing, right? I'm going to get my
Hmm.
users to do a thing. And what is equally valid is to say, all right, well, internally, what behaviors do I want from my employees, teammates, and colleagues that that I that I can change, right? Because so much of business, I mean, you could get external behavior change perfectly right and still be miserable, right? Meaning I could get every user in the world to use Uber, or I could get everybody in the world to eat M&Ms, or I could get everybody in the world to do the behavior that is profitable for me and still be pretty fucking unhappy because the doing sucks, right? The workplace
Yeah.
sucks. And so I think a lot of behavioral science that I think gets ignored, but is a really fertile place for this, is internal to the company behavior change. How do I make teams that make people happy, satisfied, thoughtful, progressive, have meaningful work that allows them to stay here in a positive way? So more recently, I've spent a lot of my time thinking about sort of like, how do we construct workplace behaviors that encourage the kind of environment that we want? Because I think, we need a company to be profitable enough to survive, right? We don't need to maximize profitability.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that, like, profitability is balanced with internal desire to do things. And the nice thing is they're very nicely related, meaning if people are happy and having fun and retained, they're much more likely to do things that are user positive, right? Miserable people make miserable people. Happy people make happy people. You want, if you're Disney, if all of your employees are dissatisfied, there's no way you're going to serve your customers correctly. And so I think that internal behavior change, that internal applied behavioral science, that same lens applied back into the business, that's the place where I have the most energy these days and where I think there's a lot of not enough work has been done.
God, I can so relate. I actually trying to build my whole company around that, like internal behavior change. And I look at culture transformation, what is often talked about when you talk about internal change, through behavioral science lens. I'm like, you want your people to be more engaged. Like, what does it mean? How will it look like?
Yeah.
And how's your system working to optimize for that? Right? If you want your people to, like, you hear a lot about people are resistant to change. How do you make them more motivated? Well, what are exact behavior? Like, what is exactly motivation for you? What should they do so that you could see that, right? And then how do you incentivize and build system? Like, and from that also perspective, like internal perspective, every business needs to apply behavioral science. Like you,
And what I would say is everybody everybody is trying to change behavior all the time. That's not new. Like we know this. This is not a novel phenomenon. I'm trying to change your behavior right now. You're trying to change my behavior right now. My kid tries to change my behavior every single day. The novel bit is the science bit. It's the regularization of a process by which we gather evidence to do that. We are all naively changing behavior all the time, but we're doing it without evidence and we're doing it intuitively. And by stepping back and saying, well, I can add formalization to process around here, you can make things a lot better, right? I think about sports a lot as a good example of a place where you can be a pretty good natural athlete and kind of get to a certain level of skill. But in order to really go to the next level, you have to stop relying on your natural intuitive
yeah,
ability to do something and really understand the mechanics of the thing, right? At some point, if you're a boxer, you can get by on being strong and fast and sort of naturally in good shape to here. But if you want to get here, you really do have to understand the sweet science. You have to understand, like, why does that, like, what are the physics of that punch? Why does it mechanically work? And then how do I change my mechanics to make this thing happen? And that I think is, when you look at management and companies, a lot of what they do is the intuitive level. Angela's a good manager, so I'm going to promote her and help her rise. And then, I'm going to rely on the fact that she's intuitively good. But that only goes so far. At some point, management becomes a science. You need to break down like what behaviors you want to see and how you're going to create a system that causes those behaviors to be true. And that's what gets you to this, to this next peak. And so I think a lot of times people are doing the naive behavior change and the tweak, the system, the systemic change is how do I actually think about this as a process that
yeah,
reliably creates an outcome? Because what science does for us is reliability, right? It's not because Angela is good at this, naturally good at this, right? It's, hey, no, I can create a whole class of managers who are really good at this because I understand what makes them good at this.
yeah, because you define the behaviors and also like you know what behaviors brings the outcomes that you actually want. And again, like for me, everything is behavioral science. Like whatever it is you want, you need to figure out again what it is I want in the end, like what are behaviors contribute to that, and then what's the point A, what's the point B, and how do people to transition from point A to point B. There's pressures, the environment and context and motivators. It's like, and once you have the process, that's it becomes, yeah, it becomes more like a science, right? And you can expect predictable results versus a lot of leaders that I talk to, they don't want to deal with that because they feel like it's this soft, messy stuff that I can't really measure and map. And that's why I'm not really going to deal with that, right? So yeah, I think like actually, go ahead.
But that's an interesting, like, you're highlighting an interesting contradiction for a lot of people, which is I firmly believe that I can change my users' behavior. I believe in advertising. I believe in product development. I believe I can change people's behavior external to the company, but I don't believe I can change it internally. It's weirdly inconsistent, right? Because if you believe that, like, if marketing can get somebody to eat an M&M, then how can internal marketing get people to, be more inclusive or be more engaged or whatever behavior we want to, like
Yeah.
not work outside of work hours? Why do you believe that you can get people to eat M&Ms but not get people to stop scheduling meetings after 5 o'clock?
Yeah,
That's a
so I don't know.
weird.
It's weird, but we people have this feature that we can see how things work in one area, and we don't transfer it to another area, right? Which is like it doesn't always happen at all. So that's how you might have a person who's amazing in business, like it's strategy and everything, but in relationship they suck. Right? Even though in theory they have all the skills they need to master this other area as well, and or that can apply to fitness and health and everything else.
Yeah.
I also think, where it breaks down a little bit, especially when leaders work on culture stuff, because a lot of them don't understand that culture is also created by behaviors. Like I always say this, there is this example. If you want to be a kind person or want to be perceived as a kind person, you don't need to tell me about kindness, anything. Just take kind actions. And I'll believe, and soon you'll also believe that you are a kind person, right? So,
Well, and to your point, behavior is also socially reinforcing. And so kind behavior begets kind behavior. And so there's a weird, you create these values, you do a culture exercise, you create these values, you translate them into behaviors that translate into those values. And the more people do those behaviors, the more likely it is that other people will do those, like, because there's a social contagion effect. And so there's this weird cycling up and down of, how do we get a behavior to permeate through an organization that I think is really that people often forget.
yeah.
So I'm with you on the, culture work, but so much of culture work breaks down at the first step of side, right? The thing about strategy, insights, design, evaluation is you really do have to do them in that order, right? And you can't do insights and design and evaluation if you haven't decided what behaviors matter, right? We can't just say, well, we want a kind culture. What behaviors specifically are we labeling as kindness, right? When we say kind, what do we mean? So we at Oceans, for example, we say no one dives alone is one of our values, right? It's about supporting other people, et cetera. But you have to say, okay, what does that physically, literally mean? That means, okay, when somebody asks in the Slack channel for help, other people jump in. That is a specific physical, literal behavior that I can go measure, modify, understand. Who jumps in? Why do they jump in? Who doesn't jump in? Why don't they jump in? What could I do about those things that would cause them to jump in, right? It's not enough to just say, well, we want a kind culture. Getting to that, like, okay, what does that physically, literally mean is so important and so often missed.
Yes. And I think also it's missed because there is even the step that's missing before that. Like, let's say you don't just want some culture because you just want it. You want to have a certain outcome. And then that outcome has to be narrowed down to a few key behaviors that then you can act upon, right? And a lot of leaders have real trouble, I noticed, translating this big outcome. Like, I don't know, we want to be AI first organization. Like, what does it freaking mean? Right? How would you see it? That's where like, well, we want this and this and this, and maybe that also as well. And like this prioritization and knowing exactly how to translate this big audacious goal into anything tangible that I found where a lot of it starts to break down.
Yeah.
So one more thing about behavioral science in business world. If you were, I know it's a difficult thing to just choose, but if you to choose one thing that leaders sort of can start with to apply behavioral science internally, specifically because that's something you're thinking about these days, what can they start with? What can they do to do better tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, again, as I said, I think every step of science depends on the previous step of science, right? And so I depends on S, D depends on I. So they have to start with behavior. And so one of the things that I always encourage leaders to do is like, hey, go watch your last all hands. Where did you use fuzzy words that are not behaviorally defined, right? Where could you do better at tightening up that connection of like, hey, here are the behaviors that are of interest to me. Here are the things that I want to do. Like, that's the part that I would encourage people to work on is the like, all right, like, how do you really tighten up that behavioral linkage on an ongoing basis? And so, I think if you're asking for one recommendation to business leaders, it's, hey, imagine I'm a genie and you can rub my fuzzy bald head and you can get your employees to do something. What are the 3 things you actually physically, literally want them to do? And then really interrogate that. Like, if you received that request as a genie, How would you fuck with it? How could it go wrong? How is it in specific? How is it not? Right. So when a leader says, well, I want people to be more inclusive, a genie will have a field day with that.
Yeah.
Right. So how can I be more specific about, oh, I
Those
want
fuzzy
women.
words, yeah.
Yeah, I want women to be talking at least 50% of the time in meetings. Okay, that's really specific. That's something we can do something about.
Yeah, and the cool thing about our world, you can now measure it with the eye. Like even this podcast, right? It has like a speaking coach or something, and it tells me exactly how much I talked and should talk for optimal result.
Yes, I mean, computationally, our ability to measure behavior directly has massively, massively increased, right? How long did each of us talk on this podcast is something that can be measured in real time, given back as feedback, et cetera. And that just wasn't technologically possible not that long ago. And so I also think there's a flip side to that, which is that sometimes people could get bogged down in the measurement part, right? One of the things that is a hallmark of the difference between applied and behavior and academic science is we're still in business here. We need to be right enough. We don't need to be perfectly right,
Hmm.
right? I need to be right enough, right? In general, I want to make sure that women are talking about comparable amounts of times in meetings proportional to their attendance in the meeting. That doesn't have to be perfectly true. It has to be true-ish, right?
Yeah.
And if I make it true-ish, that will probably power my business. I don't need every single person in the world to eat M&Ms at all times. I need some of the people to eat M&Ms some of the time.
Yeah. So also a great point. Also, not all the data that we have should be used or should be measured, right? That's meaningful data. And that's also, I think, kind of a challenge to figure out what it is meaningful and what is enough. There was one question that something that I wanted to ask about that. So I forgot. Mm, No, I forgot. Completely lost it. But now we're gonna, if you don't mind, maybe I'll remember. Let's switch to those crazy questions that ChatGPT came up before.
All right. What does ChatGPT want to know about from Matt Wallaert?
Well, actually, I did not specify in the question or in the prompt that I wanted to ask a question about behavioral science. So it kind of like asked what you most probably want to talk about, or it can be an interesting topic. One of the things that is not related to behavioral science, well, at least not right away, cognitive offloading through satisfying
Yeah.
that you famously wear automated standardized wardrobe to conserve mental energy. So beyond clothing, actually, well, why you do it, you can explain it, but beyond clothing, in leadership, in your life, where do you use it and why?
Yeah, so let's before we answer that question, let's make clear a couple of principles that underlie. So satisficing is the idea that good enough is good enough, right? That you can set some quality bar and then you can say above that quality bar, additional quality doesn't matter. The contra idea is maximization, right? So even if I'm eating the world's most delicious dish, there might be a more delicious dish out there and I can seek out the more delicious dish, as opposed to satisficing, which says, anything above a 7 is good and I'm happy with anything above 7. What AI is referencing is I'm relatively famous for wearing the same thing. So I have I don't really buy additional clothes. It's all, John Varvatos 40R blazers and Norm Timsit shirts, and that's just what I wear in my professional life. There are more famous examples like Obama
Uh-huh.
eliminated blue suits because they got confused with black suits and they're basically the same. So you might as well just get rid of the blue suits, right? There are lots of places that I'm a satisficer and practice this. I'm pretty automatic on food, right? I have a set, I sort of eat a protein bar for breakfast and I have a sort of set, a Trader Joe's salad kit for lunch and I eat the same thing every day. So there are lots of places where I try and automate that. Now, I'm not saying you should try to automate everything, right? Instead, the whole point is to reserve energy for the things you actually care about. So I love my son. I think my son is really awesome. I enjoy the time that I spend with my son. I want to spend mental energy there, finding unique and interesting things for us to do. So by, not wasting time on what am I going to eat gives me more time, more mental energy to think about, okay, what am I going to do with my son today? And so
Oh,
I try to automate the stuff that I don't really care about, food, clothes, entertainment, whatever,
yeah.
and really reserve my mental energy for the things I do care a lot about, right? In terms of, you know,
Yeah.
unique
And you,
depth.
and you think, well, I don't think I know that you wrote also about this in your book, Start at the End, when you talked about, you also want to know about like the person or a demographic that you're working with. Where do they spend or willing to spend a lot of their cognitive and mental energy? And you want to give them information or the amount of information, the kind according to first how much they are ready to spend. Like to your point, if you don't want to really think about food, it's that there is no sense for me to expose to talk to you about like this I don't know amazing meal or dish, right? And also like where do you find your user or whoever it is you're working with or whose behavior you want to modify, like at what point at the day? Obviously at the end of the day most of the people, like I don't want to have any complexity in my day, right? I'm already at my capacity. And I feel like in behavioral science that can be, well, not can be, but it is so applicable. Like you gotta know A, how much bandwidth the person has, and B, at like what time, what part of the day, and
Yeah, and I
where
think,
to find
I
them.
mean, in part, this becomes so important because there is a big difference between, the easy example for me is always computers, right? There's a big difference between the enthusiast computer market, where I take a lot of pleasure in picking every individual component and reading about it and thinking about it and all the things, right? Versus the what you might think of as sort of consumer market, where it's like, I just want a machine that works. I don't really need to know what's in it. I don't really, if it was a black box and all you said was machine that works, I would totally be down with that. Right? Here is the fastest thing you can buy at the price point that you want. Great. Right? That is
Yes.
good enough.
And such, I think just an important I don't know, subject for people to understand that our cognitive capacities are very limited. And if you spend them on things like, I don't know, women spend a lot of stuff thinking about their makeup, etc. Well, then you have so much less bandwidth to think about other important things that might be a lot more important. And that's where I also feel like women are a little bit at disadvantage because they have to think about all these different things about their looks and appearance because of society's expectations, right?
100%. We talk about the pink tax all the time. I think one of the dominant groups, and it doesn't matter if it's men or if it's rich people, like whichever kind of dominant you want to talk about. One of the strategies of dominant groups to remain dominant is to force other people to use their mental energy in order to in suboptimal ways, right? Rich
Yeah.
people stay rich by making sure poor people stay desperate, right? If poor people have to spend all of their time worrying about how to make a bill and worrying about all of these things, they don't have any time to worry about overthrowing the rich people, right?
Yeah.
Or coming up with their own ideas, or blah blah blah. Luxury has always been about leisure, right? About the ability to have the time to think about the things that you want to do, to move away from necessity. And so, absolutely, I think men have created an attention economy that causes women to spend a disproportionate amount of their mental energy on appearance-based things, so that they don't think about the fact that men control more of the power and that they should probably get more of the power back. I absolutely think that is a
Yeah.
subjugation measure. I mean,
I
religion
mean,
has used this forever. Most dominant religions are based on subjugation. They're both based on forcing people to think about a set of topics in order to keep them from thinking about other sets of topics, right? If I can keep you busy about going to heaven and thinking about, your individual sins so that you don't think about society, well, that's a pretty darn good way to control people.
yes. I think I'm actually a rebel against all of this. I try to think as of few things as possible outside of my chosen circle of interest. And whenever someone tries to tell me about it, I'm like, yeah, I'll think about other things.
Well, but it's
Uh,
also, I mean, there's a proposition of privilege to that, right? I'm a white dude, right? I'm allowed to wear the same clothes every day and not get shit in a way that, like, a woman might not be able to. I'm already the part of the dominant majority, right? You and I have the luxury of, as like relatively naturally attractive people, we don't have to think about a bunch of other things. Like, I don't have to work out that hard to not be fat, right? Where somebody with a different weight set point, if they want to fall into a social norm that is considered acceptable, they have to work their ass off to be able to try and get to that place. So, I always try and remain conscious of the fact that, like, as someone with a lot of native intelligence and good education and was born white and male identifying and all of these things, that it makes it easier for me to sort of do things like satisficing, right?
Yeah.
And the only good use of privilege is the dismantling of privilege. And so I try and be conscious of my privilege at the same time that I'm trying to make sure that nobody else has to pay attention to their privilege if they don't want to.
Yes, and I would also, I think, challenge that we have to necessarily think like what I'm trying to say. Like, well, yeah, maybe you're not the best looking person according to societal norms. So who cares? Like, my mom always tells me your hair should look this way. I'm like, I don't care.
Yes, but the problem is that, so I hear you, but society has a lot of power. So it's all well and good to say, well, I'm not going to care. But if you don't get the job, or you don't get the, romantic partner, or you don't
Yeah.
find love or friendship or those other things, I mean, we have a halo effect wherein we think that attractive people are more competent, right? And so if you're not naturally attractive and you make the decision to not fit society's norm of attractiveness, they are going to not think you are competent in the same way that an attractive person is. And that has other implications. Now, you could choose that. You can say, hey, I'm comfortable with the cost that I'm paying to actively disregard how society is choosing to judge me. But as people that do fit some of the social norms, I have to be conscious of my privilege in saying, oh, yeah, I just don't care. Well, sure,
Yeah.
because I can not care and get away with it, right?
Oh,
I can not care and be fine because I'm relatively handsome enough and I'm white and I'm male and nobody cares if I wear the same dress that I wore the week before.
yeah. Well, I think that's actually where you can also practice satisficing. Be in a good enough shape so you don't feel uncomfortable and then continue with the course. And
Yes, that's absolutely true.
yes, one thing that I also definitely want to touch upon is, well, I'm gonna start with ChatGPT prompt, but also try to connect it to ethics, which I believe we didn't talk about, but it's very important in behavioral science. So, question: being mindful of who we platform, and I think it's you who mentioned this because I haven't read it anywhere, but according to ChatGPT, you care about that. In discussing academic misconduct and the attention economy, you caution that behavioral scientists can't opt out of deciding which methods and people to amplify we should use. Well, that is not important. How do you personally decide whom to amplify, whom to ignore, and what responsibility do leaders have to ensure the ideas they platform are both ethical, and evidence-based? So that is a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there is a proportionate relationship here, right? The louder your voice, the greater the obligation to be right, right? Or to do things in ways. And right, I don't mean well, I guess I do mean evidence-based here, but I also mean sort of ethically correct. So ethically correct and evidence-based are two versions of right. The louder you are, the greater voice you have, the more persuasive it is, the more people that are listening, the greater your obligation to do that well, right? If you want to scream your conspiracy theories into a forest where no one can hear you, go nuts, right? But I think, as you have a louder and louder presence and voice in the world, you really have to be thoughtful and careful about who you platform, et cetera. And, that's hard. I mean, it's hard to do. It requires work. If you think back to the promoting and inhibiting pressure, I don't think anybody would say, I want to endorse people with bad ethics, right? But you have to put in place the inhibiting pressures. You have to address the inhibiting pressures to putting in place people who, might be bad ethics. You have to do there are a bunch of people who don't look at the podcasts before they appear on them, and they don't go research the host and make sure this is somebody they're comfortable talking to, right? And ditto with guests, right? Matt's famous, so I'll have him on the podcast. Cool, but like, what else is going on there that we need to be monitoring for, paying attention to, being thoughtful about?
Hmm. You know what I wanted to sort of jump into here? This just whole question of ethics and it being so difficult to work around because speaking to your favorite example of M&Ms, I studied nutrition science, and for me, M&Ms is not something anyone should be promoting. Like at least not in their form and shape as right now, with a bunch of sugar and all of that stuff, right? Like, but that's my opinion, right? And I believe that people don't want to be eating all the M&Ms they could be eating, but in their interest is to eat just enough to get the satisfaction they need and then move towards something which is, more balanced eating. So where like do you draw the line? Meaning, what do you promote? What do you inhibit? And what is ethical? What is not ethical? Because again, even with M&Ms, yeah, I as a company want to sell more, but actually, if I think about my user as a human with well-being goals, I should design my product so they eat less at any sitting. So then they can stop easier and, eat something better.
Well, but this is this is where maximalization sort of comes in. So first of all, I would say part of ethics is making sure that you're not impinging on people's individual autonomy. And so you and I can think M&Ms are sugary monsters, but like that doesn't mean that's everybody's opinion, and that doesn't mean that like I have the right to change people's behavior. The example I'll give you is the flu shot. If you look at the people who don't get so in general in the US, about 2/3 of people get a flu shot, about 1/3 don't. If you look at the 1/3 that doesn't, and you interview them, about half of them meant to but didn't, right? Meaning they had the intention of getting the flu shot, and for a variety of reasons, they didn't end up getting it. Changing their behavior so that their actions line up with their intentions is ethically unambiguous, right? It is very easy. If Angela wanted to get a flu shot and she didn't, making the world configured such that when she wanted to get a flu shot, she did get a flu shot is unambiguously good. Where it runs into more trouble is the people who say, hey, I had no intention of getting a flu shot in the first place. Well, that's a different story, right? If you accurately understand the risks and benefits of flu shots and you make a conscious decision not to do it, I have to respect that individual autonomy while also making sure that you have all the sets of facts that allow you to potentially revise that decision in the future. So there's a whole it's a whole hour and a half of other podcasts to talk about exactly what ethics that we're doing. The key that I always try to get people to think about is, one, do people's intentions and actions line up? Meaning, if somebody didn't intend to eat a whole bag of M&Ms and you did a bunch of things that caused them to eat a whole bag of M&Ms, well, that was not their original intention, and that's problematic, right? So I think making sure that the intention action gap doesn't become sort of like out of whack is key, right? The other thing that I always guide people to is, you have to be careful that an action doesn't come at the expense of another intention. Meaning, I intend to eat M&Ms. I also intend to not get diabetes. So those two intentions are in conflict with each other, and I need to resolve that conflict in the right way. And the biggest piece of this is just being explicit, right? If people accurately understand what an M&M is and accurately understand the degree to which it's a trade-off with developing diabetes, type 2 diabetes, then people can make their own decisions about where they are comfortable on that trade-off. This is why science has to be done in the open. The easiest ethical test in the world is, would you want your mom to know? Right? And if you wouldn't want your mom to know, that's a real fucking problem.
Yes, I guess where I personally have a problem is like, let's say mobile technology, right? That the companies want to keep your attention there, and there is not a lot of mindfulness no matter what you say. And yes, or you might think that I'm choosing it, but at the end of the day, the technology becomes addictive and you're not choosing it anymore. And so your actually intention is to use it less. And I had a bunch of clients like that, but like, I still keep doing it, right? Why is that so? Or you want to eat less chocolate, but they actually use food scientists to design the product that way, so it's harder for you to stop, right? And that's where like, where do we draw the line? Or you put the products that are not that great for people right in front of the people or at the cash register, and that promotes buying without too much thinking. And like in some countries they started to put healthier foods there, but like that's where where is the responsibility where is because for me, you still can give people freedom of choice, but you don't have to make it the easiest and, I don't know, addictive choice. It's a
Yeah, I mean, I
what do you
think
think about that?
to your point, freedom of choice is a weird phrase, right? Like, you know, you can get a bunch of sort of libertarians to die on the hill of people should be allowed to take illegal drugs and do whatever the fuck they want. And as long as they know the consequences and are willing to bear the consequences, they can do whatever the hell they want. I think that's, to your point, quite dangerous, right? We live in a society, you know, I think benevolent paternalism, has some positive features, right? We have to be careful about making sure that we are doing things that maximize the collective and global good. I really like utilitarianism, right? In its like classical sense of like there are utils and we are trying to maximize the utils across people, right? But I also think there's a lot of individual choice here. Do I particularly want to go work at Mars and sell M&Ms? No, I don't particularly want to do that. I don't know that that's congruent with my values. But is it congruent with other people's values? Potentially, right? And what I would say is all society is about conflict, right? So on the one hand, there's the behavioral scientist trying to sell more M&Ms, and on the other hand, there's the behavioral scientist trying to get people to stop eating M&Ms, right? And that tension is okay, right? And that, the soul of society is won and lost on that tension.
Yeah, I would disagree and argue about that for a lot longer, but I want to be mindful of your time.
Well, no, I mean, but do disagree. I mean, let's. I think it's worth getting into it, right? Like, it is. Let's take the Juul as a great example, like vaping. Getting people to vape instead of smoke is almost certainly good for them. Getting people who don't do anything to start vaping is almost certainly bad for them, right? And so, as a behavioral scientist at Juul, there is room to work on one behavioral problem and not to fight the other behavioral problem. I don't want new people to start juuling, but I do want people who are smoking to start juuling. Like, there are rules and ways that you can navigate these tensions, but at some level, they're unresolvable. I mean, if everybody believed the same, like, we're never going to get to a world where everybody believes the same thing, and capitalism is built on the fact that people have different preferences. So
Oh,
bring in the argument. What, should nobody ever eat M&Ms?
no, that's not what I'm advising. What I'm thinking about is designing a system where the choice, which is known to be more pro well-being promoting, like let's say eating mindful amount of sugar from the perspective of human biology and thriving is better. Like you can't say that eating unlimited amount of sugar is beneficial for anyone. And if I ask it, like, I don't know, I have never met a person who said I was happy that I ate all the sugar and made myself sick. Like, I don't know. Maybe there are such people. We all enjoy sugar. There is no doubt about that. Back to your, like, about vaping and cigarettes, right? Well, cigarettes, for example, are quite inaccessible in most parts of the world in a sense that you have to like go to a specific place in a store and it says cancer on it, right? And like you can't be a certain age to buy it in most places, right? So we design all of these barriers to make sure that the person understands that there is responsibility with this choice. And they still can make the choice, but it's more difficult. So the same as like M&Ms. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't maybe making M&Ms a candy. What I'm saying is now with it, we know that people tend to overeat if you get a whole bag. Let's maybe not sell people a whole bag or make it a lot more difficult to buy it. And was also, there were those experiments where they just separated M&Ms, for example, in smaller bags, and people ate less because there was this friction, right? So give them the bag, but also because you're a socially responsible company, also put that big bag into smaller bags, even though it will like create, I don't know, more packaging for you. But now, every time the person wants to eat more, they have to make additional choice to actually eat more of that. So I'm not saying let's just eliminate, I don't know, this or that. I'm saying things that we know to be not that great for over consuming, and we know we are not that good at managing that. Let's make them more difficult to over consume, but you still can do it, right? So that's what I mean that I don't agree with, like trying to use a food scientist to make people eat more, even though we know it causes so much trouble down the line.
I mean, I think there's two ways to resolve that tension. One is there are behavioral scientists on both sides competing. So one is the fact that as hard as someone is trying to sell you M&Ms, there's someone trying to make sure that you don't eat M&Ms, right? There's some healthy food manufacturer that's saying eat an apple instead. And there's a vested economic interest, and like there's capitalist drive on both sides of that.
Yeah.
Apple growers want you to eat more apples. M&M manufacturers want you to eat more M&Ms, and they compete to see which one is true. This is the essence of capitalism. And so the idea is that like these checks and balances will provide the right market incentives to cause this to be true. The other perspective on it is it is not, if you are if you are Mars, it is long-term bad for you as a company. If you look at profit margins over time, it is long-term bad for you as a company to only sell people an unlimited number of M&Ms that they eat all of the time, because those people will die very quickly and you won't have a consumer over time, right? So this is why diversified companies actually tend to help us with ethics, because they can profit across a wider range of behaviors. So you look at a company like Coke, where the majority of their products, Coca-Cola, the majority of their products are what you think is not particularly healthy, versus Pepsi, where they have a much wider range of brands across the health spectrum, right? So at the same time they're selling sugar water, they're also selling fortified nutrient drinks in third world countries, right? They can profit on every part of the spectrum. And so one of these ways that ethics gets, these ethical quandaries get resolved is by having diversified companies that look at maximal longevity, right? That say, hey, a really long-term, and I've always tried to work at one way to resolve the individual ethics is to work at companies where that's true. So if you look at something like Clover, where, if you make people healthier, it's good for them. They're happy about it. It's good for your bottom line because you as an insurance company don't have to pay as many medical claims. And it's good for the government who's footing the bill because they don't, they want people to be healthier in general. And they're happy to pay you to make that true. And so you can align incentives across your business to get the socially beneficial behavior to line up with the company beneficial behavior, right, at scale. Banking is another easy example, right? You can make a bunch of money on consumer banking fees, right? But the long-term best thing that makes you money is actually getting that person to be rich, right? The more money that Angela has, the more money I make as a bank, because the more money that that pumps through my cycle and system. And so it's actually much better on a long-term basis to make you financially in a good place than a bad place. And so that's where I say, a lot of the resolution of the ethics that you're pointing at is about long-termerism, right? It's about saying, hey, if I expand the profit-making view, it's much better to do A than B. And this is where the stock market has killed us, right? This notion of quarter-over-quarter returns, right? Hey, every quarter I have to make more money than I made last quarter tends me to make very suboptimal long-term decisions, right? Because I want to jack it, right, until it comes off the rails. Companies that report on longer periods, don't ignore profitability in the short term versus the long term, tend to make more what you would think of as ethical decisions around behavioral science.
Yeah, it's just like people. If you think long term, a lot of things you do short term.
A lot of things turn out better. Eat less M&Ms if you think long term.
Yes, I am a believer that we can create the world where everyone can benefit and we can think long term. And that's what kind of like what I want to dedicate my work to, because I don't. Yeah, I think we're at the point where we can see that this way of thinking just doesn't work, where you take short-term view and expect long-term to thrive as society, as global civilization. So, yeah, but and I think that's possible. That's all I'm saying. Again, M&Ms again. I'm not against M&Ms. I love chocolate. Actually, what I'm saying is we should create a system where we can enjoy it and at the same time have a lot healthier population in general. So that being said, that's I think a good note to conclude our conversation. So yeah, as a last maybe parting thought advice, is there anything that you'd like our listeners to leave with? A question, I don't know, an assignment, a thought to ponder upon?
Oh, I mean, I think that we've had a great and fulsome discussion. I do think thinking about the ethics is a good homework for people to think about, like, hey, what does it mean to change somebody's behavior and what responsibilities am I taking on when I do that? Because, as much as what I teach is about the how, right? It's sort of an undifferentiated how, meaning when I'm helping you figure out how to change behavior, I don't know what behaviors you intend to change. And the reality is that those might be negative behaviors. You could work at Juul and be getting kids to vape, right? Science is agnostic to outcome. Instead, it's only humans that can choose outcome. So science as the process makes us powerful, but it's up to us to decide how we use those powers. And I think leaving it on a note of, hey, you got to be thoughtful about how you choose to use those powers. Absolutely right.
Yeah, it's just such a great, again, way and thought to finish this podcast, this conversation, so people now have this knowledge about behavioral science, but apply it with, I don't know, ethical
Yeah, what are you going to
intentions
do about
behind
it,
it.
folks?
Yeah.
Now you know. What are you going to
Yeah.
do?
Yes, and thank you, Matt, again, so much. And the last question, should people go to learn about your work, more about behavioral science? Where do you want people to connect with
Oh,
what you do?
I'm an easy guy to find. Matt Wallaert is a unique name, and it's true on most platforms, mattwallaert.com. We just made we had a paid behavioral science course that, we have this sort of policy where once we recoup the development costs, we make it free. So that's now free. So we have a nice,
Yeah,
6 week
and I recommend
free
it highly because I
free
did it.
course. I'm a pretty easy guy to find. I'm happy to help. I do open office hours in the world because I believe that like equitable access to science is really important to me. But I think more important than trying to access me is, accessing yourself, right? If you have the choice between a half an hour talking to me and a half an hour of thinking about like, well, what behaviors do you want to change and how are you going to do it? Probably that's the better behavior. That's the better half an hour. But I'll be around if you need me.
Yeah, so again, I'm going to link your course and the website and maybe a couple of other things that ChatGPT can suggest. You never know. But thank you so much, Matt, again, for your time, for your passion for behavioral science and scientific method. And I don't know if you ever use this phrase, but you also have this scientific, compassionate, or empathetic scientific activism, something like that. I just love the idea. I think maybe it was in one of your talks, but also, yeah, just thank you for your work. That's what I'm trying to say. And being a scientist who also cares about making the world better. So thank you.
Empathetic scientific activism, right? Empathetic scientific.
Yes.
So empathy says, I believe you, right? Empathy says, I believe that things are true in your universe. Science says, and then I will try and understand why they are true. And then activism says, I'll try and do something about it, right? And so the analogy that we always use for people is like a spider web. So when you walk into a spider web and other people can't see it, but you start freaking out and doing this, empathy is believing that you're not crazy, that you walked into a spider web, even if I can't see it. Science is saying, and because I believe you, I'm going to go find the spider web. And activism is saying, I'm going to do something about it so you don't walk into it again.
Such a
Empathetic
cool
scientific
concept.
activism.
Yeah, pathetic. Say it again.
Empathetic scientific activism.
Scientific activism.
I
Yeah,
believe you.
empathetic. Yeah,
I will
scientific
act
activism.
on the things I will go find out about the things that you believe, and then I will do something about it.
Yeah, so such a cool concept. So thank you for creating it and actively promoting it and living it. And again, thank you so much for your time. It was
Thank you
amazing
for having me,
conversation.
Angela.